Welcome to season 14 of the Parenting Aces podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Stone, and this week I am super excited to bring to you a longtime tennis player, longtime tennis coach, and now tennis author and podcaster, Adam Blicher. Adam is from Denmark, and as we discussed, it's not really been a traditionally tennis-rich country. However, given the small population, they've had an incredible number of players come out of Denmark, Adam being one of them. And as you'll hear from him, he got into coaching at a very young age and realized that he had some work to do in order to maximize his potential in working with young developing tennis players at the national level for his federation and also just on an individual basis. And that has led him down all sorts of interesting paths, which he shares with us so gracefully and generously today. Before I bring Adam on, I want to just remind you guys, if you haven't already, please be sure to sign up to receive our e-newsletter. You can do that on our website, ParentingAces.com. And as I've mentioned before, one of my favorite parts of being part of Parenting Aces is working one-on-one with tennis parents. So if you could use a little bit of guidance in your own family's tennis journey, whether that's choosing tournaments, coaching, working on your own tennis parent repertoire, college recruiting, whatever it may be, I would love to work with you. And I can offer that up via a one-to-one consultation that you can schedule through our website, again, at parentingaces.com. If you just click on the shop tab, you will see your options there. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Adam Blicher. Adam, welcome to the Parenting Aces podcast. It is a pleasure to finally meet you after seeing your name and hearing so much about you for several years now. I have to tell you, I'm surprised at your youth because I expected like a 50-year-old guy after hearing all the things that you've accomplished.
I appreciate that, Lisa, and thank you very much for having me. I think I have had the privilege of growing up in a small tennis country. Hence, I've had the opportunity of being a coach from a very young age as well, and getting several opportunities.
So you grew up in Denmark, is that correct? Which, I mean, we all know Caroline Wozniacki, but like, where is tennis in Denmark other than that? For those of us who are ignorant, sorry for if I don't mean to
No,
be offensive, but we don't think of
I,
Denmark as being a tennis mecca.
No, and it isn't. I think our neighbors in Sweden used to be a tennis mecca, but then they have struggled for the past decade plus. Denmark is a small nation with 6 million people, so compared to the States, we are a mini country. Hence, I also think it's completely okay that right now we have Holger Rune, we have Clara Tauson, and as you said, Caroline Wozniacki that did a comeback but is now pregnant with her third child. I will say the Danish Federation has helped a lot in terms of the development of all of those three players. We also have a males player that is called Elmer Møller, who qualified for Roland Garros and lost in the first round in 4 sets to Tommy Paul. So I actually think right now, in terms of Danes, it's a pretty good time right now for Danish tennis. The Danish Tennis Federation have supported those players. I will also say each of them, had they been born in another country, I'm pretty sure they would have ended up along the same lines because it has really been projects that has been driven by a very significant parental figure. And I think it often ends up like that in small tennis countries. We are approximately 6 million people. There's 60,000 active players in Denmark. My own history in terms of tennis was a little bit by coincidence. I was in the local tennis club at the age of 5, and my dad was at a meeting, and I got a racket and a little foam ball, and I played against the wall, and I made it work. It probably looked a little bit awkward, but I liked it. And I said to my dad, I want to play tennis. And he was like, nah, no, you need to play a team sport. So he used a year from when I was 5 to until I was 6 to introduce me to different team sports in Denmark. And I just kept begging to go back and play this individual sport that my dad was like, ah, don't really know if I would like my son to play that. So at the age of 6, I started playing tennis. And I think that from there on, it's been not only a passion, it's been love, it's been obsession at times as well. And something that it hasn't been possible for me throughout life to ever escape it. I would say, first as a player, I tried to become as good as I could. I competed a little bit internationally as a junior, but relatively quickly realized I wasn't skilled enough. I wasn't good enough, no matter how much I wanted it, to make anything of it. So at the age of 18, post high school, I moved 200 kilometers away from my childhood home, where I could still play in Denmark, the highest seniors division. Then to support my own tennis, I was coaching in the club. To dial back a little bit, in the club that I grew up in, it was tradition. If you were one of the juniors that got a little bit more attention, but a little bit more attention, and even you mentioned my age, I'm mid 30s, so I'm not that old. But when I grew up, I had organized practice 3 times a week. And I was a top national junior and I was playing some of the junior national teams. Compared to today, if you are similarly in Denmark, you have formal practice every single day and usually a private coach in the weekend. And that might be a little bit of a rabbit hole to go down, but I think that to me is by good intention by all coaches, and I have done this. I've been guilty of that myself, trying to make it as professional and optimize it as much as you can. But then I think things can be too crazy too early, taking away the love and the ownership of the sport, leading to burnout. I think I was very lucky growing up in a tennis club where I had formal practice a couple of times a week, but I was hanging out in the tennis club all the time. I was there, I was playing, then I was practicing once in a while, then we did homework, and that was basically just where I grew up. And then at the age of 18, moved 200 kilometers away, continued being a coach. And due to it being a small country, I was very lucky that the coach in that club, he called up the Danish Tennis Federation and said, well, this Adam guy that you know because you've been traveling with him, he's now a little bit into coaching. So I was really lucky that I got a phone call from the Federation basically saying, you're very young, you're very inexperienced. We are lacking a junior national coach. We can't call you that, but would you be interested in just starting to come in, be a little bit of a sparring partner, uh, organize some practice camps or some training camps, maybe go on a travel or two? And before I knew it, I had spent 6 years at the Danish Tennis Federation, having the time of my life and kind of operating in between the federation, the clubs, the coaches in the clubs, and the parents, and trying to piece all of that together. I don't think I succeeded very well the first couple of years. I was not strict and firm enough on my own coaching philosophy. And I was not really good at clearing roles and expectations, which I think is super important in tennis, because the reality is in most places, and I don't know if it's the same in other countries, but in a lot of sports in Denmark, you can go to a local club and basically put off your child, and then they have the opportunity of coming professional. Whereas I think tennis is a sport where if there's not big support from a parental figure, it's going to be super difficult. And there will be various coaches going through that journey. But if you're coach hopping and you're constantly switching for someone that might have a few more credentials or a little bit more experience, well, then it's also going to be holding the development as well.
Before we started recording, we were talking about your kind of idea of what tennis parents are about. And you shared with me that at the beginning, you, like many junior coaches, looked at us tennis parents as a pain in your rear end.
Yeah.
What changed your idea, or what helped shape your current thinking around the role of the tennis parent?
Yeah, so just because it was said off air, let me just repeat what I said in terms of it was very evident to me the first couple of years where I was trying to juggle being a tennis coach and being some kind of a link between the federation, coaches and the clubs, parents, players. I After I think 6 or 7 months, I was like, wouldn't it just be easier if I just kept parents completely out of this? Because this is just a whole mess. And these parents at first, they seemed super nice and they were super friendly. And then I started getting these very long emails and text messages and calls almost in the middle of the night, and especially on Norwegian trips with junior national teams. Like I was using as much time on trying to manage parents and their expectations as I was just dealing with the kids and whatever was going on at a tournament. And I was super frustrated, and I was pushing parents away more and more. And I think that only led to more friction and more frustration. And I think I was very lucky in the sense that I talked to older and more experienced coaches than myself, and they were really good at being a mirror in terms of, well, to what extent are you being transparent about your philosophy as a tennis coach, what you believe in? That was the first time I realized, well, I don't really know what I believe in. Like I inherited something from the coaches that have brought me up, but is it also actually what I believe in? Or am I just flying a little bit around in the wind, measured up against whatever parent or coach or player that I was dealing with? And secondly, they were like, well, it's okay that you are relatively strict and firm in what you believe in, but you need to, the most important thing is that you have something you believe in, and then you communicate that and you're transparent about that up front in terms of clearing expectations, so they don't think that you're just a laissez-faire coach standing in the back not saying too much. If your philosophy is actually, well, you're trying to help them become good problem solvers on their own, well, then you need to simulate that in practices. And it might be obvious in your mind, but you might look disengaged to the parents of junior national team players. So you need to state that up front. So I did a 180 in terms of how I dealt with parents. I invited them in a lot more, and I was being, or trying to be, as transparent as I could. And my realization was the more time I use on parents, the less time I use on them. But it needs to be upfront. And then obviously certain check-ins, and still friction, still sometimes fireworks, but a lot less when including parents a lot more. What I also found was it was interesting. Then I started to call into parent meetings, and that I actually I continue to do that, and I still do that. But I'm also sometimes doing it a little bit by improv, because what I figured, and I've heard Mike Barrell say the same, and I have the exact same experience, is if you're calling in for a parent meeting, well, all of the parents that provide zero trouble, they will always be there. But the parents that you would really like to reach and get aligned with, clear expectations and roles in order to make the best possible collaboration, typically they won't show up. So whenever I could, when there was a tournament, if there was a championship in Denmark where I knew that the parents would come to see the kids, then I would have prepared a small presentation, booked a room in the club, and then at one point, when it was possible, just said to all of them, hey, can I please just grab your attention for 10-15 minutes? And then I tried to get through with them.
Yeah.
So I'm
So
trying
you're
to be.
preaching to the choir at these meetings. And it's honestly, I think that's a challenge for all of us in any type of setting where we're trying to change the status quo. The people who are paying attention are the people already doing the good things. It's the people that are not engaging with us by choice, by lack of information or whatever, that we really need to reach. And that's, I think, an ongoing challenge for anybody trying to educate masses of people around a certain subject.
Exactly.
And social media has helped with that somewhat, but I say this all the time. I mean, one of the things that makes me the saddest is when I meet someone with a 17 or 18-year-old and they say, "Oh my gosh, I wish I'd known about you 10 years ago." I'm like, "Well, why didn't you know about me 10 years ago? I've been here."
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a shame. I haven't been good at it. I've done it in a couple of instances, but I haven't done it enough upon reflection, because there will be tennis parents that have kind of done the whole ride from starting their kids starting out in tennis into being a little bit competitive locally and then regionally and then maybe even on the international junior circuit, or trying to go from a talented junior into the professional circuit. And I think being a tennis parent is a tough job. It's not like getting your kid into a lot of other sports where you can basically just drop your kid off and then everything is going to be taken care of. There's a whole system in tennis that you need to kind of understand, and you need to understand the different levels in terms of understanding, well, what is this all about? And I think the experience of tennis parents is something that is a little bit neglected. And I think we as tennis coaches, including myself, sometimes is not good enough at, I'm not necessarily saying educating parents, because that also sounds a little bit wrong, but just helping parents understand, well, what is this tennis all about?
And what is their role in the process, right? And this is a good segue to your book, Winning Words, which I want to talk about. And I think that was kind of the impetus for our introduction, was the fact that you had released this book. But I'm sorry, I'm like pulling up stuff on all my screens. But when we first exchanged emails, Adam, you said to me, "Well, I'd love for you to read my book, and I really want you to focus on part 3 of the book, because I think that's the part that really applies to the parents." I read your book and I came back to you and said, "Well, wait a minute. I think it's really important for us to talk about parts 1 and part 2, because parents need to understand what coaches are thinking and the things that coaches are learning to make themselves better at this communication piece. And if parents have a clearer understanding of this whole process, it helps the whole triangle, the parent, player, coach triangle, function more effectively." And you were like, "Oh, yeah, okay, let's do that. Let's talk about all 3 parts." So that said, tell us a little bit about the book, and what was the impetus behind your sitting down and actually writing a book?
Mm. It's been a long process in the sense that I started my own podcast in 2015, and basically it was a response to, I was traveling around on behalf of the Danish Tennis Federation, and I had all of these conversations with tennis coaches, and I felt so enlightened all the time, and I was learning so much. And at that time, I just started to listen to tennis podcasts myself. And podcasts in general, I would say. And I was listening to, for instance, the tennis podcast, which I'm still listening to this day, and those are journalists talking about tennis. And I was really missing a tennis coaches podcast. Today, there's so many different tennis coaches podcasts, but at that time, I couldn't really figure that out and see any. And then I was like, well, maybe I should just create it. So that it was basically my way of just putting online some of the conversations that I already were having with coaches. And then it also became my excuse of knocking on doors that then got opened because I had a podcast, which I otherwise then I wouldn't get to speak to those people. And to me, I've been on loads of different coaches educations. I hold a master's in sports science, which I also find a little bit like a coach's education. But I think where I have learned the most has been just talking to other like-minded tennis people. And at one point, I started to transcribe the episodes and just try to see, well, what are some of the shared denominators? And Some of them are, I don't know, we should say obvious, but not necessarily interesting to write a lot about. For instance, a common theme among all of, not all, but a lot of the podcast guests that I had, or the coaches, was quality over quantity, for instance. But something that started to come up the more that I looked into it was an emphasis and a focus on soft skills rather than hard skills. And to
Do you
me,
want
some of
to do you want to explain what that means for those who might not be familiar
yeah,
with those terms?
so soft skills for me, going into pedagogy, going into communication, going into how do we create trust in a relationship? How do we relate the knowledge that we have inside of our head? One thing is that we know all of the technical and the biomechanical knowledge and the way that we have been taught that information. But what is also the best way to relate that knowledge so it makes a difference in the player that is standing in front of us, and probably more importantly, the human being that is standing in front of us that has then chosen to play tennis. And all of a sudden I was like, because the the coaches that I've talked to are not necessarily academic. They are practitioners. But the more that I read into it, it's like, this is so interesting. There's so much about the softer skills in terms of something that is not necessarily that quantifiable. There's a lot about pedagogy and a lot about communication. And this is really something I don't know whether it's true across countries, but in Denmark, there's been, I would say, over the last 10 or 15 years, as the occupation of tennis coaches have become a, there's more tennis coaches today and more full-time coaches. Previously, it was a lot of either voluntary coaches or part-time coaches. And a lot of them had an educational background as teachers. Today, it's a lot more on players who played themselves to a certain level. Hence, I also believe, again, I don't know if it's true for anywhere else than Denmark, but I believe a lot of tennis coaches in Denmark, they don't necessarily have the same pedagogical toolbox, so to speak. And then I was like, I think there's plenty of books on technique, on tactics. I also think there's plenty of books on the mental aspect, but on pedagogy and especially going into communication, I'm not finding a lot of books. And hence I was like, a little bit like the podcast, this doesn't seem to exist. So why don't I try to formulate something about that?
That's fantastic. And listen, we talk about communication on this podcast all the time and the importance of it and how do we get better at it. And the fact that when you are working to get better, you're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's okay. And it's important to acknowledge the mistakes, especially between parent and child. And to, as the parent, if you make the mistake with your child, to apologize for it, ensure your child that you love them and you're working to be better at this and that you're learning as alongside their learning. But the same goes with the coaches, right? Coaches are constantly learning and developing too. And I think to acknowledge when, as a coach, you make a mistake, whether it's something minor or something major, letting the player and the parent both know that you acknowledge that mistake, you apologize for it, and then you work to learn so that you don't repeat it, I think is an important part of that whole trust aspect that you mentioned at the very beginning.
Yeah, I believe that's essential also in terms of the feedback that we provide, also to a large extent determines what is going to be the mindset of the player. I believe that our voices will be the voices that will be inside of the player's head. Hence, when a frustrated parent or frustrated coach would call me up as a sports psychology consultant and say, oh, this player is so results oriented, or they're so afraid of making a mistake. Very often when we dial it back, well, then we get to, but this player also has a coach that has a mantra of you can't make mistakes. And then it's like, of course this player is going to be super tough on themselves. being in a sport that is basically built around errors, and it's impossible not to lose points. It's impossible not to make forced errors. We can make the distinction between unforced and forced, but there's a whole education about the game and the way that we communicate. It could also be the parent, and obviously none of the parents that are listening into this podcast would be the parents that on the way home from a tournament, if the player has not performed, whether it's a win or a loss, but not performed to the expectations, well, we know a lot of the players, their feeling of being on the back seat on the car ride back home is sometimes a little bit like an interrogation. A very enthusiastic and well-meaning parent might be asking questions along the way of, well, couldn't you see it was much better then, or why didn't you? You look so disengaged when. And the younger the player, the more inexperienced, the less reflective, maybe they actually don't really know what went on. And they were panicking a little bit out there, which looked like hesitation, and the hesitation looked like they didn't care. Then they're sitting on the back seat and they don't really know what to answer. And the less they answer, the more the parent is like, well, I've used my whole day and the weekend, and you have two other siblings, and we could have done. And then it's just like you don't even care. And I think I'm exaggerating a little bit because I don't think it's like that in all cars. But I think it's very important to know that especially kids to a certain age, they might be left with that feeling. And then that might be one of the reasons why when it gets tight in a match, that instead of thinking about, well, how can I execute my next second serve? They might be thinking about, if I miss this next second serve, I'm going to be in that interrogation on the way back home, and I really don't want to do that. And then it's going to be super difficult to execute that serve.
Right, right. And this is why I think it's so important for parents to understand how their words and actions are internalized by their children. And again, we've talked about that a lot on this podcast. But what I thought was really interesting, and I'm just looking at my highlights, and my stupid Kindle keeps turning off, and I have to keep turning it back on. Sorry about that. One of the highlights I put down was that it's really important for coaches to have that post-match conversation with their player. And if the coach isn't having that post-match analytical conversation, then the feedback, the loop is broken and development suffers. Because how are you supposed to learn? Because, we've all heard you either win a match or you learn from a match. How are you supposed to learn if you don't have a coach there talking you through the things that happened and helping you understand where you can improve for the next time?
I think this is really, and I think this was the basis of me saying before we started the recording, and when we first got in touch on mail, was there's basically three parts to the book, so three sections to the book. The first section is called Off the Court, second section is called On the Court, and third section is called At Tournaments. And the reasoning for me saying, well, I think in terms of parents, then at tournaments is probably the most relevant, because the book is meant for tennis coaches primarily, but also think there is something for tennis parents in there, not just tennis coaches. Because the reality of a lot of setups in tennis is that day to day on the practice court, it is a tennis coach that is guiding whatever is happening, but it's not always the tennis coach that will be there at tournaments. So then the parent will also get a double role in that they are both a parent and they are a supporter, but they're also kind of a tennis coach. And I think in there, clearing roles and expectations with the responsible tennis coach is of absolute essence in terms of keeping the developmental loop going, no matter whether we are winning or losing. And I think we're dropping the ball very often on that. So I always believe that a player going into a tournament needs some clear pre-match focal points, whether they are defined at the end of the Friday practice together with a coach, whether the coach is sending them to the parent, whether they are created between the parent and the player, or if the player is old and mature enough to set them themselves. I don't think that is that important, and it will be individual for each setup. The only thing that can't happen in my head is that no pre-match focal point is set up. And to me, the pre-match focal points needs to be set up in accordance to the player philosophy. And that's a whole other theme where I think sometimes we, in the tennis coaching business, we get fed up in technique and in strokes, in forehands and backhands, but we talk a little bit too little about the tactical part and talking about game identity. Well, what kind of a player are you, Lisa? Are you an aggressive baseliner? And what does that then mean in action? Does that mean if you're an aggressive baseliner that pre-match, that for instance, a focal point could be for you to stay close to the baseline, be aggressive on the opponent's second serve, or trying to cover 2/3 of the court with your forehand, if that's a clear weapon of yours? I think we need to go be that specific in order for a player to have something to refocus to. Because what oftentimes happens, and what is the difference between practice sessions and matches, is that you get feelings involved as well. And if you're caught by your feelings and don't know what to refocus to that can help you execute, well, then oftentimes, especially as a parent, you will be shaking your head and you'll be like, oh, I thought this coach was brilliant and we've worked so much and now we wasted all of that money. And I think maybe it's more a matter of let's be clear before match. And I think before match, we shouldn't do too much. Maybe it's one focal point, maybe it's three, but it's absolutely not seven.
Yeah.
Those focal points. Yeah.
Well, I just want to stop you there to kind of expand on this. I think, the danger, like you said, is when there is no conversation around what the focal points are. And as the parent, when you are sitting in the bleachers or in your little camping chair watching your child play, and you have a clear understanding of these are the 1, 2, 3 things that I'm to watch for in this match and report back to the coach on, not have a conversation with my child necessarily, but report back to the coach on, it gives me as the parent a way to stay focused on the very tangible items and keep track of those very tangible things. Maybe they are things like maintaining emotional control. I mean, maybe that's one of the focal points. Did you go to the towel between points? Did you do these things that are part of your ritual on the side change? And as the parent, I'm looking for those things and making notes about it to report back to the coach. But the danger comes in when there are no focal points discussed between the coach, player, and parent. So the parent is just there focusing on entirely the wrong stuff, maybe. And the player doesn't go into the match with that focus and understanding what it is they're trying to accomplish. Yes, of course, they go into every match wanting a W at the end of it, but that's not going to happen, and it's not 100% within your control as a player. What is within your control is implementing the focal points that your coach has specified to you. So I think from the coach's perspective, I think a lot of coaches maybe don't understand the importance of having that conversation with the player and with the parent prior to a tournament weekend, and understanding how much that can change the entire relationship between the three of them. And that's one of the things you write about a lot in your book. And I'm so grateful to you for putting that on paper and sharing that out with the junior developmental coaches out there in the world.
Thank you for that. I'm happy that my work comes across in that way, and I would also say I'm standing on the shoulder of giants in that I'm using a lot from other coaches as well in terms of what they have said on the podcast, and then my role in the book is trying to make a red thread and make it meaningful to the reader. But I think you're touching upon something that is super important in terms of, I think oftentimes, whether it's for a tennis coach or a tennis parent, then when we're looking at a tennis player or our own child playing and think, oh, my daughter is so mentally weak, I think more times than not, it's not a mentally weak player, but it is a player that is not clear on their focal point. They don't know what to refocus to. And then I think it can be different again, and that is up to the individual setup. Well, who is determining those pre-match focal points? But if they are not set, and where I think I've gotten a lot wrong in the past, has been before a match, well, then I've tried to talk into the emotional state of the player instead of actually focusing on their game plan and what they should execute on. So I've been saying to players, just go out there, play freely. Or one of my favorites would be to just go out there, enjoy yourself. And it would be the same as like, oh, just go out there. There's no reason to be nervous. And all of us would be like, yeah, we understand, like logically, there's nothing to worry about. I'm not gonna die if I'm losing this tennis match. However, our reptile brain, it doesn't understand that. It feels like life and death out there. So obviously we are going to become nervous. We're not going to be positive all the time. We're not going to believe in ourselves after missing our backhand into the bottom of the net 3 times in a row. And what is going to help us in that situation is not trying to believe more in ourselves, but it's likely to refocus to the focal point that we have practiced on the practice court that helps us get that backhand in. And I think in there is a huge responsibility for the coach and the parent to together figure out how do we best get this across to the player. And the last final words before a player goes onto the court, well, maybe it's just a matter of, could you please repeat some of those focal points? Or would it be an idea for you to just write them down on a piece of paper so you can look at them at the changeover? Because sometimes we forget in the midst of pressure and all of the feelings that are going on. So I
Yeah.
think that's an essential task. And even to play a little bit of a devil's advocate on the sentence, I know it's not your saying, but you said with either we win or we learn. I think a little bit of an overlooked thing is, well, what can we learn from a win as well? Because when we lose, it's very easy to go like, what happened? Why was that? I think sometimes we actually forget that a little bit when we're winning. We just like hands in the air. But that's really the time for me to be like, what? Why did you perform so well today? Like, let's be curious about that. So I think that's
Yeah.
super important to get that developmental loop going from match to match in a tournament, but especially from the practice court to the match court and then back to the practice court. Because if those two are separated, then we are risking that development is not accelerating in the way that we desire.
No, I think that's an important point, and you're absolutely right. Maybe I need to change my wording around. But I do think it is so interesting when our kids come off court and they've won, there tends to not be very much analysis happening, either on the part of the player or the parent. And if the coach isn't there, certainly not on the part of the coach. So yeah, I think that's a really good point and something that I'm hopeful. Listen, my point of having you on and having this conversation with you after having read the book is I want every parent watching or listening to this podcast to insist that their child's coach read this. Buy a copy. It's not very much money. It's a minuscule fraction of the cost of 1 hour on the tennis court with your child's coach. Invest in this book, and it's available on Kindle, and we'll have the links in the show notes. But insist that your child's coach read this book, and you as the parent read this book. And if your child is age 14 maybe or older, they should also be reading this book and understanding what the role of the coach looks like in an ideal situation, what the role of the parent looks like in an ideal situation. And then again, that triangle, we all work toward that. It's not to say we're going to be perfect. We're not. We're human beings, as we point out all the time. We're going to make mistakes, but why not strive for this high level of execution as a coach, as a player, as a parent?
Yeah. And I'm happy that you're saying that. And on purpose, I've tried to make the book available For as little as possible. The Kindle version, the ebook version, is the equivalent of your favorite chocolate bar. The paperback is a little more, but as you said, not a lot. So hopefully, it should be affordable and also worth the time investment, which I think is the biggest one. But I also think, and I think you're a good proof of that, it's not a long read. Basically the book is meant as a book for someone being tennis coaches that are not necessarily reading a lot of books. So I believe that you can read this book in 1 or 2 sittings with a good cup of coffee or whatever you desire. And then just touching back on, Lisa, what you said in terms of the evaluation after match. I think depending on the player, depending on what happened in the match, I think it's probably not the time to evaluate the match right afterwards. You might sometimes need to relatively soon after due to another match coming up. But if it's a loss and there's not a match straight away, I think it's also about having an agreement on when are we going to talk about this match. And then whether you're a coach or a player, then always start out by addressing those focal points. Those will be the ones to evaluate the first. There will always be a result, win or lose. And if you haven't defined those pre-match focal points, well, then the evaluation is oftentimes heavily colored by the result. And that's a shame, because all the time we're trying to make a developmental loop. So I would go back to, in the start of an evaluation, if we're going back to the example of you being an aggressive baseline, I'll say, well, Lisa, tell me now you played this girl, Sarah, and before the match we talked about you staying close to the baseline. On a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 was you did a terrible job and 10 you did unbelievable, where were you today? And then I would make it a guided discovery in terms of, well, you might say, it was only a 4, Adam. And then I say, it's interesting. Why wasn't it only a 2? Getting you to argue, why wasn't it all bad? What did you actually do well? And then I would go in the other direction and say, okay, so you said, so I understand that it's not only a 2. That makes sense to me. If you want to, in the next match, to get it to 6 or 7 even, what should you change? So then we're getting that same player to reflect on, well, what can I do differently? And then I would just reinforce it. And obviously in the start, you need to help that player a little bit. But relatively soon, even at the age of 9 or 10 or sometimes 11, players will become pretty good at figuring this out. Be like, okay, so maybe I was a 4 today. The reason I wasn't a 2 was because I did, when I got the break in the first set to 4-2, then I really started to dominate more with my forehand and use it more and not accept that many backhands. If I need to go to 7 next time, I need to use my forehand from the start. It's my biggest weapon, it's my biggest opportunity of scoring points, but it just feels more nice to accept those backhands. So I really need to dare to go around and upgrade my backhand to a forehand. Well, there you got it. And then that can also be the starting point for the next match. Remember last time you played and we talked about you being an aggressive baseliner, using your forehand a lot, and you use it when you're comfortable, when you're in the lead. But remember today to really use it from the start and invest, even though you might make a couple of mistakes. It's very important to utilize it from the start, because that is your biggest asset. It's your biggest weapon. So having that all the time, I think is crucial. And then as parents or as coaches, we will be, whenever we're watching a match, even if we're watching French Open right now, in all matches, we will be like, this could be better, that could be better. And we can make a list of 10 or 12 different things, even with the professionals. So imagine every single other player. It's such a long list. And I think where I've also gotten wrong in the past is I wanted to show how much I knew as a tennis coach. So I've listed everything that the player did wrong for the player and the parent. And I completely robbed them of all of their self-confidence, where the reality was, maybe besides touching upon the pre-match focal points, if I felt like 1 or maybe 2 things was critical for the next match or whatever it was, maybe to address them, but I can't say 7 things. I need to save that and note that down for the developmental plan and be like, well, next time I'm on the practice court, then I might address back to, well, Lisa, do you remember that match you played against Sarah? One of the things that I noted down was that you need to be a little better at taking away time from your opponent. And that's also a way to put pressure on your opponent, not just hitting harder. Why don't we work a little bit on that? And in there, I really think we need to remember a lot of tennis coaches and parents as well. We are really trying to help the players, but in that eagerness to help, sometimes I also think that we do too much. Whether it is coaches talking too much on the practice court, or whether it is an evaluation turning into almost a presentation about all of the mistakes. I think we need to be, that's exactly where I think we as coaches and parents needs to be very disciplined in our communication.
I agree with that. And one thing I want to just point out in all of this very valuable information you're sharing is it's important for coaches to understand that you as the coach have the experience and the language. We as tennis parents and our young players especially may not have that language yet to talk about our matches and our play in the way that you as a professional coach can talk about it. So one of the responsibilities of the coach is to use that language, talking with me as the parent, talking with my child as the player, so that we start to incorporate that vocabulary ourselves, and we have the means to explain our performance and understand our performance in a language that's common to all of us in this triangle, right? So I think a lot of times coaches just start spewing information and expect us to really understand what it is they're trying to tell us, and we just simply don't understand it because we're still new, we're still learning.
Yeah, and I think it's really important from different angles. I think very few players, whether it's recreational or high performance players, will have the same coach from the day they start to the day that they finish playing, and hopefully they will stay in tennis forever in some way, shape, or form. I think then we've done a good job as tennis coaches, because the reality for most of us as tennis coaches is that 99.9% of the players that we deal with, they will be recreational players in one shape or another. So there's multiple purposes here. There's not only trying to make the player perform, it's also to use tennis as a vehicle to teach valuable life lessons, to help players be more clear on a clear value set, and then develop a love for the game. Because hopefully they're going to stay in tennis and not just quit when they figure out, well, I'm not going to be the next Serena, I'm not going to be the next Novak Djokovic. I think then I've terribly failed as a tennis coach if that is the players that I'm fostering an environment around. And I think in there is also something about, and going back to that first section about the book, that is called off court. And I think parents to some extent will be the person that will be in their children's tennis life forever. And therefore they need to know a little bit about the vocabulary, as you said, and they need to understand what has happened in the instance that a coach is changed. Otherwise, it's going to be super difficult. Not all tennis coaches would like a parent to be involved. I think it's also very important as a tennis coach to be clearing expectations and roles in terms of, I'm not necessarily going to let you as the parent dictate what I'm doing, but let's have a collaboration. Let me understand what is the previous practice schedule, what does that look like? What is strength, weaknesses, what have you experienced in the past, what has worked well, what has worked less well. And I think that whole part that I in the book have called off court, it's a part that I think both tennis coaches but also parents tend to skip. So the very first chapter in the book is called Clearing Roles and Expectations, and it can seem a little bit boring, but I think it's so crucial to just have a sit down, even if it's just for 15 minutes, to be relatively clear on what is the expectation from the family to the coach, but also the other way around? What are some of the non-negotiables? It might be something around hustle on the practice court. It might be coming on time. It might be about body language or how we communicate. There might be a lot of different things, but I think it's so important to set them down and be very clear on expectations, on roles, non-negotiables, but also setting up some boundaries. I think one of the places where I've gone a little bit wrong as a tennis coach is there hasn't been any boundaries. So I've not been very good at separating the private and the professional part. And I think if you as a coach, and that can come from a very good place intentionally in terms of, well, I'm really engaging myself into both this player and the family and so on. But then the lines can also get blurry to an extent where there's not the necessary respect. And that's super difficult. And even though it can seem a little bit awkward, I think those things are important to address straight away.
Well, and it requires the coach to get introspective and to formulate their philosophy, as you talked about early on. You have to have your philosophy, and then you have to be able to communicate that to the family that you're going to be working with. And the family, you have to be aligned, because if there's not alignment, you're just setting up for conflict from day one. So I think that's a really good point. But even before that meeting, the coach has to do the work to figure out, what kind of coach do I want to be? How involved do I want to be with this kid, with this family? Where does my own family, my own personal time fit into that? How do I make this work for me so that I can do this as a career choice for the rest of my working life and feel good about it, right? So it's not, I mean, there's so many intricacies to this, and it's not just, okay, I'm a great tennis player, I've been on tour, or I had a great college tennis career, maybe I've suffered an injury so I can't play anymore. Oh, I know, I'll be a tennis coach. Let me buy a bunch of balls and a hopper and go set up shop at my local court and, be a tennis coach. No, it has to be intentional. There has to be some thought put into it if you want to be successful and you want to be effective.
And I think you're touching upon something that I could just shoot at myself and say, I think most of us as tennis coaches don't really have a philosophy. It's not something that we have. And I think as a parent, I think it's our job to push a little bit, not to get a full philosophy necessarily, but to try to understand, well, what are some of the underlying assumptions? How is this tennis coach operating? To me, my experience was in 2013, I was awarded Coach of the Year in Denmark. In 2015, I was awarded Paul Arbour Young Coaches Award, Special Recipient by the ITPA, and I traveled to Atlanta and I received the prize, and I was super proud, and I cut a family trip short. And I met a gentleman who you might be familiar with called Alistair McCall, and he was super, super friendly to me. And then I remember at day two, he was like, after a couple of conversations, he was like, hey, Adam, what's your coaching philosophy? And at that moment, I came up with an answer, but I realized I'm just winging it. I really don't know. I feel like I'm on top of the world. 2 years ago, I was awarded Coach of the Year in Denmark. Now I'm in Atlanta getting a recognition for being a coach under 30 that has made a mark on global tennis. But I'm actually just winging it. I'm not really a professional. So the next book, that might be a little bit of a teaser. I have the 10 first chapters in draft format. It's actually just about that. It's about how can we as tennis coaches, how can we write up a tennis coaching philosophy? How can we at first look back and be aware of what set of glasses are we looking through? What are the underlying beliefs about the technical, the tactical, the physical, and the mental aspect that we have likely inherited by the coaches that were coaching us? So what is it that I actually believe in? And then using that to decide, well, is that actually also what I would like to believe in? And what is my core cause? What are my values? Also, what is the environment that I'm a part of? So with my core cause and what I'm trying to create as a tennis coach, what might the friction points be with players, with parents, with club boards, whether you are in a country club, whether you are in an academy, whether you are just a private coach or whatever you are, what are some of the expected friction points? Just like a tennis player would go through friction points in terms of being down 40-30, 4-5 in the first set and missing their first serves, that would be a friction point. I think coaches need to do the same in order to also be standing tall, knowing what is it actually that has shaped me? What is my core cause? What will be friction points? How can I prepare myself for those? And going forward in some of the difficult conversations that I need to have with parents, with the club board, or whoever, how can I do them the best? And I think a little bit like the book Winning Words about communication, again, to me, I'm not saying I know that there are other excuse me, there are other resources on communication, for instance, this one. But I think compared to a lot of the other resources that are, there's not a lot. So that's again a project in my mind where it's like, it's not going to be a perfect project, but I think it's an important project.
I agree 100%. And I hope you'll come back once the next book is finished and we can dig into that, because I think that'll be another very interesting conversation. Adam, I hate to cut this off because I'm enjoying chatting with you so much, but out of respect for your time and our listeners' time, I'm going to bring this to an end. But just a reminder to our audience, we will have a link to Adam's book in the show notes on parentingaces.com so that you can purchase it. I hope you will share it and really gently, or maybe not so gently, insist that your child's coach have a copy and read it. And I think it's going to make that triangle function much more smoothly and be beneficial to everyone, but most importantly to our children, who we all want to see achieve their best selves through this process of junior tennis. Adam, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Lisa, so much for not only taking the time to read my book, but also having me on here, and for your passion for the sport, trying to make your mark. I know that you're making a difference with this. What I would like to offer back also in terms of you invested some time here. I obviously hope that some of the listeners would be interested in the book, but what I would like to do is, and you will know the logistics of this, but the first 3 that get in contact with you, whether you can determine whether it's by mail or social or whatever it is, I am then happy to send a physical copy, a paperback version of the book to them on my bill. So 3 free giveaways from my side, and you decide how they need to approach you.
I love that. Thank you so much. That's so generous. And I will say, let's do this via social media posts. So the first 3 that repost this podcast and tag Parenting Aces. And what is your tag on social media, Adam?
My name, and that's going to be difficult to say out loud in English, but Adam Blicher. So AdamBlicher on all social.
Awesome. So tag Parenting Aces, tag Adam Blicher, and you will be in consideration for a free hard copy of his book. And I, again, encourage everybody to purchase it, read it, share it with your coach, share it with your child if they are of an age that you feel like they would understand it and benefit from it. Adam, again, thanks so much for taking time to be with us. To my audience, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on Parenting Aces.